All right, picture this. You're on a flight just like dozens of times before, right? You're cruising above the clouds, sipping a soda, everything is totally normal. And then, in a literal fraction of a second, your entire world just shatters. 33,000. That is 33,000 feet. It's basically the ultimate nightmare scenario. Imagine just being thrown into the freezing, super thin air from that staggering altitude. No parachute, no backup plan, zero way to steer. You are completely at the mercy of gravity, plummeting over 6 miles back down to Earth. I mean, it's terrifying. It completely defies belief, and realistically, it should mean a 0% chance of survival. Or, at least, that's what everyone thought.
So that brings us to a frankly impossible question. How on earth do you survive a 33,000-foot fall? Look, when you're tumbling from cruising altitude without any safety gear, the human body just isn't built to take that kind of impact. Yet, we're actually digging into this today because one woman, just one, completely defied the absolute certainty of physics. She survived a drop that should have been 100% fatal.
So, let's dive right in. In today's Explainer, we are going to break down what has to be one of the most astonishing, mind-bending survival stories in the entire history of aviation. We're looking at the 33,000-foot miracle, the story of Vesna Vulović. Her survival is this wild cocktail of extreme tragedy, sheer luck, and unbelievable physics. It sounds like something straight out of a blockbuster movie, but I promise you, it actually happened, and we are going to unpack exactly how.
Part 1. A routine flight. Setting the scene in January 1972. To really wrap our heads around this miracle, we kind of have to start with the ordinary stuff. Meet Vesna Vulović. She was a 22-year-old flight attendant working for Jet Yugoslav Airlines. Young, loved traveling, loved meeting new people. She was literally just like any other crew member heading to work that day, expecting a totally peaceful winter morning. Passengers were boarding, stowing their bags, getting cozy. There was absolutely nothing weird going on, and nobody on board had any clue they were about to become part of this incredibly dark, yet incredible, chapter in aviation history. Vesna wasn't some extreme skydiver or survival expert. She was just an everyday person doing her job.
Part 2. Disaster in the sky. An explosion at 33,000 feet. The sheer speed of how this disaster unfolded is just staggering. We start with normal cruising, flying over what is now the Czech Republic. Everyone's just kicking back. Then, as investigators later figured out, a bomb in the luggage compartment detonates. This massive, deafening explosion rips right through the aircraft's structure, and this instantly leads to the plane completely breaking apart. Debris is suddenly scattering over this huge area, and finally, the terrifying reality hits: the 33,000-foot plunge. I mean, this wasn't some gradual descent or a bumpy emergency landing. This was an immediate, catastrophic structural failure that basically left the passengers and crew with absolutely no chance.
Part 3. The 33,000-foot fall, plummeting 10,160 meters down. Just really think about the scale of that drop for a second. To put it into perspective, that is actually higher than Mount Everest. Falling from that height means a descent that takes several agonizing minutes, hitting terminal velocity while plummeting toward the freezing, rock-hard ground. So, how did she survive? Well, it wasn't magic. It was this bizarre, almost impossible alignment of survival factors. First off, Vesna didn't fall totally exposed. She was trapped inside a section of the aircraft fuselage that, amazingly, stayed partially intact. That basically acted like a makeshift shield. Second, that specific piece of wreckage crashed into a heavily wooded hillside. Those thick trees acted like a giant natural shock absorber, snapping and bending to slow down that metal tube. Third, there was deep, heavy snow covering that slope, adding another crucial layer of cushioning to soften the extreme impact. But hey, even with all those physical barriers, it still would not have been enough without this final piece of the puzzle. And this is where the human element of this whole miracle really comes in, the immediate medical aid. See, the wreckage crashed into a super isolated area, but a local villager managed to reach the site incredibly fast. And we're not talking about just any villager here. By sheer unimaginable coincidence, this guy had previously served as a military medic. He knew exactly what to do. He found Vesna alive in the wreckage, critically injured of course, and was able to provide the immediate, specialized, life-saving aid she desperately needed just to keep her breathing until more help could arrive.
Part 4. Recovery against all odds, a true medical miracle.
Because, let's be real, surviving the physical impact of a 6-mile fall was actually only chapter 1 of this ordeal. When she finally got to the hospital, she was in a very critical state. We're talking a fractured skull, multiple broken bones, and severe, life-threatening internal injuries. It was catastrophic physical trauma, and doctors initially had very little hope she'd even make it through the night. But then, the miracle just kept going. Vesna spent months in the hospital going through this incredibly grueling treatment and rehab. Defying literally every single medical expectation, she remarkably regained the ability to walk. And what's really fascinating here is the sort of psychological mercy of it all. She woke up with absolutely no memory of the explosion or the terrifying fall itself. Her mind entirely shielded her from the trauma.
The global medical community's reaction? Well, it can pretty much be summed up by this quote right here. It was one of the most extraordinary cases in medical history. Doctors, trauma surgeons, aviation safety experts all around the globe were just completely amazed. They were intensely studying her case, trying to make sense of the biomechanics that somehow allowed a fragile human skeleton to take on that massive amount of kinetic energy and actually live to walk again.
Part 5. Science, Luck, and Legacy.
Even decades later, her story continues to totally captivate us, and her legacy is literally written into the record books. So how do we make sense of this impossible reality today? Because, as we've seen, it wasn't just a random fluke, but it wasn't exactly pure science either. It sits right there at the perfect intersection of both. Her survival was recognized by Guinness World Records for the highest falls survived without a parachute. And let me just make this super clear. To this very day, nobody has ever matched her documented survival from such an extreme height without a parachute. It's a record that stands entirely on its own, a totally singular data point in the entire history of human survival.
Ultimately, the whole thing really comes down to this massive showdown: science versus luck. On the science side, we have these very clear physical explanations, right? The fuselage acting as a shield, the dense trees slowing down the mass, the deep snow absorbing that kinetic energy, and of course, the immediate triage by a trained military medic. We can calculate those things. We can totally understand the physics of it. But on the flip side is luck. Just the sheer astronomical improbability of every single one of those factors aligning perfectly. Think about it. If she was in a different part of the plane, if the hillside was rocky instead of snowy, if that specific villager hadn't been a medic, the science wouldn't have mattered at all. Together, they created what has to be one of the most unbelievable true stories ever recorded.
Which leaves us with this final, kind of provocative thought to chew on. When does the impossible actually become reality? We all walk around every single day with a pretty firm idea of how our world works. We know what gravity does. We definitely know what a 6-mile fall means. But Vesna Vulović's story forces us to pause and realize that sometimes extreme 1 in a billion improbabilities can entirely rewrite those rules. It's this wild reminder that not everything is a given, and sometimes the absolute most impossible outcomes are the ones that actually happen. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep questioning the impossible, and I'll see you guys next time.